Today, we're going to talk about how to actually release trauma from the body. And I want to start out with this quote by Peter Levine, who is the founder of somatic experiencing. And he says, "Trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence." And I love this quote because most of us, we've experienced trauma in one way or another, but it does not have to define who we are or how we live the rest of our lives. And I am a living example of that. Now let's dive in. So we love the idea of releasing trauma, and social media especially loves this idea. It's almost like, we can just have a big cry or we can just shake it out and be done. But that's just not how it works. It's not that simple. Because number one, trauma healing it's a gradual process, right? It's not just a one-time event. And number two, it's a body-based and mind-based process. It's not just one or the other. We need to actually combine and marry both worlds. And so after 14 years of literally obsessing over how trauma healing really happens, and after working with hundreds of clients and also being on my own trauma healing journey, I found that there is a repeatable 3-step process that anyone can follow no matter what the trauma is. I'm going to show you exactly what these 3 steps are in this video. One thing to understand though is that trauma healing is like an iceberg. So the techniques that promise quick release, they're really only addressing like 10% that's visible above the surface. But it's really the 90% below, right? In our nervous system, in your unconscious mind, in your body's cellular memory that needs to be addressed for real transformation. And so I'm going to be taking you beneath the surface to where lasting transformation actually happens. So here's a little overview of what we're going to talk about. Number one, what is trauma actually? The reality of, trauma isn't actually released. Then we're going to talk about the 3-step somatic repatterning method and why quick fixes don't work. And at the end, I'm going to share a few action steps with you. All right, let's talk about what trauma actually is. Now, I can talk about trauma all day long, and I could make probably a 1-hour video just on defining trauma. So let's keep it simple for today. Trauma really is any event that is too overwhelming for the nervous system to process at the time, which then leads to disconnection and stored stress and incomplete stress cycles. Now, I understand that's a lot. There's a lot in this one sentence, right? It's overwhelming, right? And it leads to disconnection from ourselves, but often also from other people. It causes stored stress, mainly because we have incomplete stress cycles, right? A trauma is like a stress cycle starts, but it can't be completed, okay? And then we have stored stress in the body. Now, trauma isn't really the event itself, though. It's how our nervous system reacts to the event, okay? This is really important to understand. And it is also the underlying beliefs and stories that we develop as a result of having had that experience, but especially as a result of how our nervous system got wired based on that event, right? And so trauma can result from a variety of different events. It can be acute shock events, can be chronic, can be subtle disruptions in early caregiving or in our environment. So oftentimes we sort of disregard the trauma of events that didn't happen. So maybe you didn't get the love that you needed. Maybe you didn't get the attention that you needed. Maybe you didn't get the co-regulation that you needed when you were angry, or you weren't allowed to feel your emotions, or you were shamed for feeling sad, right? Now, there's several different categories of trauma, right? A lot of people think that trauma is only shock trauma, right? It's a one-time event like an accident or abuse. But there's way more than that. There's developmental trauma. So anything that happens in the first few years of our formative years, basically when we're still developing as a human being. There's complex trauma. There is attachment trauma. There's birth or prenatal trauma. So there's lots of different kinds. And essentially, though, what they all have in common is that there's stored activation in our bodies, and that sort of shows up in different ways. Number one, physiological manifestation. So there's these incomplete stress cycles because our nervous system and our bodies, they couldn't actually metabolize the event. There's unprocessed emotions, and there's a dysregulation in the autonomic nervous system because of these incomplete stress cycles and unprocessed emotions. And then we have mental manifestations. So there's going to be limiting beliefs. There's going to be stories that are based on the overwhelming experiences. And so all of this together then impacts many different areas of our lives. It impacts our body. For example, we might have digestive issues. It affects our immune system, and we might have a lot of inflammation. It affects how we regulate our emotions or not, right? It can affect our sleep patterns. It can affect our social connections. It impacts our relationships, and it impacts how we relate to food, for example. It impacts addictions, right? So there's so many different ways that trauma affects our lives. Now, the reality is, though, that trauma isn't just simply released, okay? Because trauma is it's an ongoing process, not a one-time event or a dramatic release. And so overall, we can say that healing is about reconnecting with our body and with all of the wounded inner parts that were affected from the trauma. And it's about building capacity, right, in our nervous system, in our bodies, and learning to process stress as it arises, okay? Because essentially what happened because of the trauma, most of us then have a smaller window of tolerance, meaning we have less capacity to be with activating sensations in the body. And so we need to work on building that capacity. And it is about relearning a language, okay? We got to learn or relearn, because we used to know the language and we used to speak it really well when we were little children. But eventually, as we get socialized and conditioned and programmed, we forget how that all works. And so we need to relearn to speak and to understand the language of the body, the nervous system, and of our unconscious patterns. And we need to help the nervous system become more flexible. Right? We want to widen our window of tolerance, create more capacity so we don't get stuck in fight or flight or in shutdown or in these freeze states. Okay? Because that's what happens because of trauma. We have less capacity and we get stuck in these survival states and struggle to come out of it. And that means that our nervous system is essentially dysregulated. And so it's not about getting rid of the trauma. We can't get rid of the trauma. The trauma happened, right? The event happened, and our bodies, our nervous systems, they had to adapt to what happened. But it's about relating to the trauma differently and to what happened, and making the body and the mind a safe place again, right? Because oftentimes, because of trauma, no matter what the trauma was, our mind and our bodies are not safe. Okay, many of us dissociate, many of us split off from the body, many of us split off certain parts in our psyche because it's too painful or too uncomfortable or too stressful, right? And so we don't want to eliminate the experience that happened. We want to integrate the experience. We want to integrate all the affected parts in a way that they no longer control our lives. And so we have to work top down, right? Mind affecting our body, and bottom up, using our body to affect the mind, not just one or the other. It's about blending them together. And so let's go into the 3-step somatic repatterning method. And this is really the foundation of my work. And it's based on the CAI protocol, capacity, alignment, and integration, which is what we're going to be covering in the next part of this video. And essentially, this method addresses trauma healing through a systematic body and mind-based approach, not just one or the other. And each step sort of builds upon the previous one. And then that creates a stable foundation for lasting transformation rather than just temporary relief. Because that's what I experienced on my trauma healing journey for many years. It was doing a lot of trauma release exercises and practices and workshops and events. And I went to so many things and did so many things and tried out a bunch of modalities only to experience temporary relief. After a few weeks or a few months, I would have to realize, oh no, the pattern's back. It's still here. Nothing's changed. And that is so frustrating, so frustrating. And eventually though, I found ways that actually helped me to experience lasting transformation. And I made it to the other side of trauma, I guess is what I could say. And so the first step is building capacity. This is huge. Many people and also many therapists, they kind of sidestep here. They override this one and go straight to step number 2 or step number 3. But building capacity is really essential. And building capacity is about training your nervous system to experience activating sensations without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. This is what building capacity really means, okay? And so we want to come home into our bodies by creating a sense of safety, which is essential for all trauma healing work. We first have to establish a sense of safety. Because at the time of the traumatic event, you didn't feel safe enough to fully process it. And so you had to suppress your emotions for survival. And in essence, we want to rewire the nervous system, right? Because when we've experienced trauma, most of us then either hang out in sympathetic mode most of the time, fight or flight, or in dorsal mode, right? In shutdown or depression and freeze. And so we want to retrain the body to spend more time in the safety state, right? Which helps you be more flexible and adaptive rather than just reactive. Okay, the safety state is the ventral vagal state. It's also why, social media is really crazy about the vagus nerve, right? Now, there's some core practices that we can employ here. Number 1 is resourcing, which is really about identifying and cultivating internal and external resources that help you feel grounded and safe. And we can do this internally or externally. We can use, for example, breath awareness or body sensations that feel good or neutral, or we can use memories of safety, of love. And externally, we can utilize supportive relationships, right? Friends, maybe family. It could be going out into nature. It could be music that helps us soothe and feel calm. It could be your dog, your cat. They're beautiful co-regulators. It could be sacred objects. It could be certain activities. And then another key concept here is pendulation, which comes from somatic experiencing, but it's really about practicing moving between comfort and slight discomfort to build resilience, right? So for example, we might notice a challenging sensation in the body, and then we can shift our attention to something that feels good or neutral, and then we go back to the more uncomfortable sensation, and then we go back to a part that feels good or neutral, right? And so we pendulate back and forth. And this teaches the nervous system that it can handle activation without getting stuck, right? This is a really beautiful practice. And then nervous system mapping is another big piece here. It's about learning to identify your triggers and your glimmers. Glimmers are moments of safety or ease or relaxation. And triggers is, anything that sort of activates us or triggers us. The triggers, they send us into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses. Glimmers is what brings you back to regulation and presence. And there's some practical tools that we can use. There's breathing practices, functional, conscious breathing to help regulate the autonomic nervous system. Something like coherent breathing with diaphragmatic breathing, like 5 to 6 breaths per minute to activate the parasympathetic response that helps to rewire our nervous system. We can use somatic practices like body-based exercises that build awareness and regulation capacity. So things like NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, or also called body scans, which is really a systematic attention to different parts of the body. We can use grounding practices. So lots of stuff that we can do here, but really it's also a great idea to work one-on-one with a practitioner, with a coach, with a therapist, to help you build capacity, okay? And train your nervous system to be able to be with activating sensations in your body. And lastly, this is also a big one actually, is metacognition and habit change. Now, as much as the focus is often on these practices or going to therapy or doing coaching, we oftentimes need to modify our lifestyles to support nervous system health and to actually support building capacity. And there's these 3 non-negotiables. Number 1 is diet. Okay, we need to eat foods that support rather than stress the system. If all we do is eat processed foods, drink a lot of caffeine, eat a lot of sugar, a lot of carbs and whatnot, that makes it really hard for our nervous system to get into balance, right? Food is huge. It sustains us, gives us energy or pulls energy from us. Movement is absolutely essential if you're on your healing journey, right? We need some daily movement, going on daily walks, going to the gym, anything that helps you feel good in your body. It doesn't have to be intense. Sometimes that's not even possible depending on what nervous system state you're in. But movement is essential for our nervous system, and not just temporarily for a few months, but for the rest of your life. I'm going to be going to the gym for the rest of my life, 3 or 4 times a week. I'm going to be walking 10,000 steps per day for the rest of my life. So that's just a non-negotiable. And then the third one is sleep. We need to prioritize rest and recovery cycles in order to help our nervous system regulate and build capacity. If I don't have a good night's sleep, my capacity next day for conflict, for triggers is so much smaller. My window of tolerance just shrinks. I need my 7-8 hours of sleep to really be all in to, create a capacity that helps me when there's a trigger, when there's a stressor, because that's life, right? They will happen eventually. And then lastly, something that can totally support us on our healing journey are supplements. But don't just take any random supplements. Go to a functional doctor, for example. Go to someone who really knows what they're doing and get your blood work done, get all your hormones sorted out, and based on the results, then take supplements, okay? You want to have a custom plan as to what kind of supplements, how often, how much, rather than just, which I see a lot of people do. They see people on social media talk about ashwagandha and talk about magnesium and talk about X, Y, and Z, and then they just take it without actually knowing what their bodies, what their nervous systems actually need. But this can be also a really great help, especially if you're having also chronic health symptoms or digestive issues and whatnot, which was actually a big piece also on my own journey, was taking the right supplements. Now, next step is coming back into alignment. And this is all about learning to be with and process the experience of activation, right? Meaning sensations and emotions in your body without resistance, right? Just let that sink in for a moment. Learning to be with and process the experience of activation, namely sensations and emotions in your body without resistance. That means emotional fluidity, okay? Because healing trauma requires completing the trauma stress cycle that was interrupted during the original overwhelming experience. And so in a healthy situation, right, after a threat passes, the body then returns back to safety and regulation through a natural discharge. I'm sure you've seen, animals do it, dogs do it, they shake it out after they had a stressful moment. And we humans were not different. Right? But when we experience trauma, this natural discharge doesn't happen, right? And so often in childhood, or maybe when escape wasn't possible, the energy then gets stuck in the body, or the emotion gets suppressed. And then our body constricts and tightens up. And so we need to teach the body to move through activation and emotions by not resisting sensations and allowing natural responses. And this is not a one-time process. This is, again, a gradual learning and relearning, right? And so It's about learning to let emotions move through you rather than storing them or suppressing them. Okay, most of us have learned at some point in our lives to suppress our emotions, to not let the anger out, or maybe to explode with anger, which is also not healthy, or to suppress our grief and sadness, or to get completely lost in grief and sadness, right? So oftentimes there's these extremes as to how we deal with emotions or not deal with them. Another big part of this is self-compassion and really approaching your experience, your emotional experience, your stress or trigger experience with kindness rather than judgment. This is one of the biggest pieces on the trauma healing journey, actually. And I think I'm going to have to make an extra video on this. And with self-compassion also comes welcoming and acceptance, right? Really making space for whatever arises in our bodies and in our experience without trying to fix it or change it immediately. Rather than being like, I don't want to be angry now anymore. You know, I was angry for 5 seconds. I don't want to be angry anymore. Or I don't want to be sad anymore. Or I don't want to feel this way anymore. I don't want to be anxious. That actually makes the experience bigger, right? It usually means that we're resisting what we're experiencing. And that means that it usually isn't able to flow through us. Now, there's 2 pathways that we can come back into alignment, right? Because this was just a theory, but there's 2 pathways. There's the titrated and more gentle approach. This is, for example, somatic experiencing. Hakomi, can be NARM, can be EMDR. And those approaches are generally best for people with a very high activation in their nervous system, with maybe intense anxieties, with panic attacks, highly dysregulated nervous system states, or maybe active PTSD, and of course everybody else. But generally, if you have any of the listed symptoms, then I would start with a titrated and gentle approach. Because the second pathway, which is more cathartic, more activating, is really best suited for people who already have a fairly regulated nervous system and they can handle more activation. One modality here would be conscious connected breath work, where you activate the body to access altered states of consciousness, to process stored emotions and, reveal unconscious patterns. Bioenergetics is great, which is Wilhelm Reich's work with body armor and energy release. TRE, trauma release exercises. But also psychedelics and plant medicine can be really helpful. And they were also on my journey. All of these were actually on my journey, were very helpful, where we use altered states of consciousness to access and process deep trauma material. And that can be anything, psilocybin, MDMA, ayahuasca, iboga, ketamine, DMT. But it's really important when you're on your trauma healing journey to not just do them randomly or go to a random group event. At best, I'd highly recommend you do it either in a very small group setting, just a few people, or, best case scenario, do it in a one-on-one setting, which is what I did. And, in general, these practices, these approaches, they activate the body to allow movement, to allow sound, to then express incomplete impulses in a safe setting, right? And so that's what I meant with, they're best suited for people with a fairly regulated nervous system. Because if you fall under this category here, if you have high activation in your nervous system, then these practices are probably going to be too much. And they might make things worse before they get better. And so at best, you stick to the titrated approach first, and then eventually you can move on to the cathartic approach if it's still needed. Okay. I started out with the more cathartic approach and then moved into the more titrated and gentle approach. This is what my path was. And many other people start the other way around. There is no right or wrong way, but it is a good idea to know where you're at in terms of your nervous system and in terms of your internal state and the activation that is generally present. Even though I was also more leaning towards sympathetic arousal, fight or flight most of the time, I wasn't highly dysregulated, okay? And so I had somewhat of a fairly regulated nervous system. But many people that have a very dysregulated nervous system end up doing a lot of these practices, right? Lots of activating practices, only to then repeat a lot of the patterns and only to maybe just get stuck in these states and not be able to shift into parasympathetic response. So also, if you do any of these practices, I highly recommend you work one-on-one with a therapist or a coach at the same time so that they can help you integrate the experiences. Overall, though, what's important when it comes to, coming back into alignment is that we want to access suppressed emotions or repressed emotions, because oftentimes we've repressed emotions, when we were little children and we kind of split them off. Some of us, we have an easier time accessing anger and really struggle to access grief. And then others, they struggle to really access anger, but it's fairly easy for them to dip into sadness and grief. Okay. So at the end of the day, we want to be able to come into connection with both of them. Okay. Anger is, especially for women, mostly the more suppressed emotion. It's not always just for women, but there's a bit of a pattern there for sure that, more men find it easier to access or express their anger than women. And grief is really about allowing the natural mourning process for what was lost, what was never received. And in both ways, it is important to include the body, because anger and grief, they're not just mental processes, but we can't just release anger once. We can't just release our sadness once or 5 times. It's about building an ongoing relationship to our emotions. And those two, anger and grief, are like 2 of the main primary emotions that many of us have issues feeling and expressing properly, right? And then lastly, step number 3 is integrating the unconscious. We cannot neglect the unconscious. Our nervous system is the unconscious. Our body is the unconscious. So we have to work with unconscious patterns, with our unconscious beliefs and the parts of ourselves that were formed during traumatic experiences. And this is where shadow work comes in, right? Which is about reclaiming disowned parts of yourself that were split off in moments where we needed to survive. And parts work can be a wonderful way to do shadow work, right? IFS, internal family systems, I'm a huge fan. As a receiver, as a client, but I also work with it with my clients, which is all about recognizing that we all have different internal parts with different needs and functions. We're not just a mono mind. One part that most of us have going on, especially when we've experienced trauma, is the inner critic, right? Which is the voice that developed to keep you safe by pointing out potential threats or failures. And I used to have a really, really strong inner critic. That part was just, it was just on and on and on and on, judging me, judging others, and just, making my life really difficult. But the inner critic is oftentimes also an expression of a dysregulated nervous system. It's an expression of trauma. Once I've healed my trauma, once I've learned to regulate my nervous system and actually create more capacity, that inner critic started to quiet down. And I would say if before it was like turned up to 100, now, on like my worst day, maybe it's at a 15. And usually it's like non-existent. It's really interesting how that works, but I truly believe that the volume of our inner critic is definitely impacted by the state of our nervous system. And then also shame. Shame is something that so many of us that have experienced trauma carry. And it is the deep belief that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. And I remember for the longest time, for many years, I was walking around on my trauma healing journey. Nothing was really helping. I kept on repeating the same patterns, was in the same relationships, kept on, experiencing depression and anxiety. And I was just like, what is wrong with me? I literally thought something was wrong with me, right? That there's something I needed to fix, but I couldn't figure out how to fix it. So, something's got to be wrong with me, right? And so many of us carry this, and shame shows up in so many different areas of our lives. Again, this is going to be a topic for another video. Now, attachment and survival patterns, huge, especially when we're growing up in the first few years of our lives. Many of us experience something like a mother wound. And so We need to heal the impact of our maternal relationship patterns on our nervous system, right? The relationship with our mother. It doesn't mean that we have to heal that relationship in real life, but we need to integrate that wound, right? And the part of us that suffered because of our relationship to our mother. The father wound, right? Addressing paternal relationship and how it impacts authority and power dynamics. Again, huge. These two, they usually show up in relationships. And if you have issues in relationship or when you're dating, then those two are some big, big parts to look at. And lastly, also looking at boundaries and learning to say yes, learning to say no from a place of clarity rather than fear or guilt. Again, this is oftentimes a symptom of having experienced trauma in one way or another, is that many of us struggle to actually set boundaries, to say no, right? Or even say yes, but actually knowing when to say what, right? Many of us are so disconnected from what we really want, what we really need. And so reestablishing a connection to our body really helps us to tap into our intuition and to really tap into our needs and to know when something is a no and to know when something is a yes, and then develop the capacity to say no and potentially disappoint someone and be able to stand in the fire, right? And so there's some supportive integration practices as we're integrating the unconscious. Journaling is great, a daily journaling practice, just stream of consciousness, even if it's just one page, goes a really long way because it helps us to uncover unconscious material. Guided parts meditations, right? Starting to dialogue with different aspects of yourself. Doing inner child work, right? The inner child, again, it's really like the inner critic is just one part of our inner family. And doing inner child work really means reparenting these younger parts of ourselves that were wounded. And what's really important to understand here is that our early experiences with our parents, with our caregivers, they shape how we regulate stress throughout life. And so if our caregivers were dysregulated, right, then we as children, we learn faulty self-regulation patterns. And so healing often involves learning to listen to and care for our body's needs as an adult. This is huge because no matter what happened later in life, those early years, especially from, when we were conceived until about 7 years old, they shape our nervous system, they shape how we regulate our emotions, and any stressful or traumatic experience that happens later is then literally based on the foundation that is present within ourselves from these early years. And so usually, if we've experienced trauma later in life, we're going to probably also have to look at our formative years, our attachment wounds from, early in childhood. Now, why do quick fixes not work? Because I really wished that they did back then on my healing journey, but I had to eventually come face to face and have a reality check with the idea that there is no one size fits all approach. There is no quick fix method for releasing trauma. It just doesn't exist. We all have different nervous systems. We all have different backgrounds. We all have different traumas. And so surface solutions like breathwork, like tapping, like shaking, they can provide temporary relief, right? In the moment, if you're about to have a panic attack and you know of a breathing technique to calm yourself down, then by God, please do use it. However, this is not going to heal the underlying trauma that's beneath your panic attacks, okay? Because simple techniques, they don't address the root cause. This doesn't mean that they're not helpful. They can be very helpful in creating more capacity. They can be extremely helpful, right? But they don't address the root cause. And so that's why I'm such a big fan of a multi-modality or multi-faceted approach to healing and releasing trauma, right? And some of these practices, I'm sure there's people out there who sort of figured out a way to cope with life and their traumas by simply just doing trauma release exercises, by just doing breath work and tapping and whatnot. But for most of us, healing requires deeper integration and processing of what's actually stored in the body and our minds, our psyches. Okay. True healing is about integration. Integration is a huge word. And I think it's really, the meaning of it is sort of underestimated. But it actually means all these parts that we had to split off, as we were experiencing the trauma, as we were growing up in a dysfunctional family, all these parts that we had to split off, all the anger, all the, the shameful parts, all maybe even our joy. It means that we have to reclaim these parts and reintegrate them into one big whole unity. Okay. And that means that we also need to process what's stored in our bodies, in our psyches, while building new capacity for presence and regulation. Building capacity to be with activating sensations, for example, as we talked about in step 1, is not something that you do just once. It's something that you have to do over and over and over again, because that's how our nervous system learns. That's how our brain learns. It's by repetition. It's not a one-time event. And overall, it's about reconnecting with your body's basic signals and needs. Again, that is not something that you learn by just releasing trauma in quotation marks. Okay. And so we do need some patience. It doesn't mean that it has to take as long as it did for me. I don't think that is necessary at all. It took, for me, to be honest, it took way too long, because back then Instagram wasn't the place it is now. You couldn't just learn about trauma healing on Instagram or on YouTube. There were books out there, but I mean, it was difficult to sort of get to a place where I would even allow myself to accept the fact that, okay, I might have experienced trauma. I did a lot of talk therapy. I did, a lot of the classic stuff. And, but whereas nowadays it's so much easier to get access to all this information, and people are talking about it all over the place, which is awesome on the one hand, but obviously it's also comes with its, downsides as well. But overall, I'm a fan because it helps people to wake up. It helps people to learn more about about trauma in the nervous system and about healing. And therefore, it is so much easier these days to get access to support and help, which is what I didn't have back then. And so I don't think it is necessary because it definitely took me a good 8, 9, 10 years to get to where I am today. And I do think that it is possible in a way shorter amount of time, right? But your journey is your journey. My journey is my journey. They're all unique, and one journey isn't better or worse than any others, but it does require a bit of patience and definitely a fair amount of self-compassion for wherever you are on your journey. And now lastly, let's get to the action steps so you actually leave with something practical after watching this video. And now the first step here is to assess, identify where you are in your healing journey. Are you highly activated? Maybe you need to build capacity first. Or do you already have some regulation going on and you can work with activation? And so, understanding your starting point really determines your pathway. And then you can start building capacity. So begin with capacity building practices like daily resourcing, nervous system mapping, gentle somatic practices to create safety in your body before attempting to process activation. And then choose your path, right? Based on your nervous system's current state, select either the more gentle, titrated approach or possibly the more activating methods that I shared with you earlier. Now, it can be a really, really good idea to work with a qualified practitioner when needed, because I do believe that trauma healing often requires witnessed, supported processing by another, right? A therapist, a coach. And again, just to remind you, this is an ongoing process of coming home to yourself. It is not a destination to reach. And with this, my friends, hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to dive deeper, I have another video here for you. And with this, I'll see you soon. Bye.